They were supposed to be delicate, pure, powerless. That is how history books, novels, and paintings have long portrayed white women of the slaveholding world. But step inside the halls of a plantation, behind the thick wooden doors of private chambers, and another story takes shape. A story that drips with disturbing obsession, a story of unspeakable acts, a story never meant to see the light of day. Imagine a candlelit corridor. The floor creaks beneath bare feet. A whisper echoes through the stillness. Behind one door sits a mistress of the house, dressed in silks that glow in the faint light. Outside, the world believes her to be fragile, a saint, a victim of her husband's tyranny. But inside, in the silence of that locked room, she holds a disturbing power, a secret connection to the very men society told her to despise. This is not the delicate, passive figure remembered in romance novels or plantation folklore. This is a woman cloaked in privilege and shielded by purity, yet consumed by obsessions that turn black male slaves into targets of her darkest desires. Her hands may not have gripped the whip in the fields. Her voice may not have shouted commands over gangs of laborers. But within her household, she was judge, ruler, tormentor, and sometimes far more than that. This is the disturbing history of white women's hidden connection to black male slaves, and the nasty truths they never wanted revealed, because what happened in secret could destroy the very lies America was built on. The 1700s and 1800s saw the spread of sprawling plantations across the American South and the Caribbean. These estates rose from stolen land and stolen lives. Their grandeur built on the backs of enslaved people whose labor was coerced, brutalized, and erased. The mythology of slavery was carefully crafted. White men stood as masters of the fields, while white women appeared as fragile blossoms of virtue. They were painted as victims of patriarchy, cloistered, sheltered, dependent. Literature called them angels of the household. History called them powerless. But in reality, the private world of the plantation home told a different story. Mistresses managed the domestic empire. They disciplined servants, allocated food, dictated tasks, and, when they chose, wielded cruelty with a sharp edge. They were victims of patriarchy in public, but private tyrants when ruling over enslaved men and women. Imagine the silence of that candlelit corridor once more. Every footstep meant fear, because behind one door, the rules of society twisted into something darker. Here, the myth of purity collided with the filthy truths of power. And inside these walls, disturbing secrets began to grow. White men controlled the labor in the fields. White women enforced control within the home. This division gave mistresses constant access to enslaved men placed in positions of proximity. Drivers who oversaw carriages, grooms who cared for prized horses, servants who dressed them, carried messages, poured water into baths, and attended to the most intimate tasks of daily life. The same men who laced their gowns by day could be summoned at night for something far more disturbing. Mistresses relied on enslaved men for daily comfort, yet held absolute power over their bodies. In a society where white women were denied open sexual expression, the enslaved man became the hidden outlet, the silent victim, the captive who could never refuse. The culture of silence was the system's most effective weapon. Black men had no voice to resist. To speak out was to invite death. To resist was to risk mutilation. To survive meant silence, submission, and carrying trauma that no one would ever allow them to name. Slavery did not only steal labor, it created distorted relationships built on fear, obsession, and domination. And inside these twisted dynamics, disturbing secrets began to thrive. Forbidden desire cloaked itself as control. In the silence of private rooms, some mistresses pursued the very men society declared untouchable. Their actions were not whispered romances. They were unspeakable acts, power wielded like a weapon, obsessions dressed in secrecy. To the outside world, these women embodied innocence. But in secret, they turned enslaved men into objects of fixation, caught in the grip of disturbing fantasies. For the enslaved, refusal was never an option. A word spoken too firmly, a glance that lingered too long or not long enough, could be twisted into evidence of defiance. And defiance was punished with cruelty. Some mistresses lashed out when their desires were unmet, resorting to humiliation, false accusations, and violent punishments. One whisper that an enslaved man had looked at her improperly could be enough to bring the wrath of the master, the lash, or even death. In this way, humiliation became a weapon of survival for mistresses, masking their secret obsessions by framing enslaved men as predators. The filthy lies of purity held strong. Publicly, these women clutched prayer books, hosted church gatherings, and embodied the myth of innocence. Privately, they crafted disturbing rituals behind locked doors. Testimonies hint at secret rooms where men were stripped not just of clothing, but of dignity, forced into silence while society praised their tormentor as a saintly wife and mother. And there was jealousy, raw, burning, and merciless. White mistresses often unleashed their rage on black women whom their husbands had violated. These women became easy targets for scorn, beatings, starvation, or exile to the harshest labor. Yet the obsession didn't end there. Some mistresses redirected their fury onto black men, turning them into instruments of revenge or objects of forbidden desire. This was not love. This was not intimacy. This was degradation masquerading as control. The stories passed down whisper of secret chambers, attics, and cellars, places no guest was ever meant to see, places where silence thickened like dust and the air carried the weight of unspeakable acts. Imagine the terror of being summoned into such a room, knowing that compliance meant shame, but refusal meant a punishment that could destroy your life. These were not accidents of history. These were deliberate abuses of power, filthy obsessions that white women prayed would stay buried forever. But for the enslaved, the consequences were unbearable. Black men lived trapped in an invisible prison. They could not speak of their torment. They could not seek comfort in community, because to admit the truth was to risk everything. Silence was the only shield, and even that could not protect them from the crushing weight of fear. Their identities were stripped away. Their masculinity was stolen, reduced to the demands of a mistress whose obsession held the power of life or death. The emotional suffocation was relentless. Every glance in public carried the possibility of suspicion. Every step in the corridors of the big house carried the weight of being watched. Their very bodies became battlegrounds for a mistress's fantasies and frustrations, and the shame did not belong to them. It belonged to their oppressors. Yet the system forced them to carry it in silence. Generations felt the scars, families fractured by secrets, lineages marked by hidden ancestry that whispered of disturbing unions no one dared to acknowledge. The trauma became inheritance, passed down in silences, in stories left untold, in the shadows of memory. These were stories that break your heart because they reveal just how far power can twist the human soul. Yet even the nastiest secrets cannot stay buried forever. Slave narratives, written by those who escaped, began to hint at what was unspeakable. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and others left words that cracked open the silence. Jacobs in particular spoke of the cruelty of mistresses, of jealousies that burned like fire, and of a hidden world of punishments inflicted on enslaved men and women alike. Her testimony was not just about the brutality of white men. It illuminated the disturbing role of white women, a role history tried to erase. Court records, rare but telling, expose flashes of truth. In some cases, accusations of impropriety against enslaved men masked the mistress's own acts. To protect their reputations, they would destroy the very men they had secretly pursued. One accusation could mean a hanging, a mutilation, or a body left broken in the fields. The dirty secret was this: the lie of purity was preserved through the sacrifice of black men's lives. Whispers endured within enslaved communities. Stories told in hushed tones around fires, fragments carried across generations. These oral histories spoke of mistresses whose cruelty was laced with obsession, of men who bore scars both physical and invisible, of women whose jealousy left deep wounds in black families. The whitewashed histories of the South left them out, but the truth remained, burning quietly, refusing to die. Today, modern evidence continues to strip away the mask. DNA revelations uncover lineages no one can explain away. Family trees branch into places polite society never acknowledged. Historians piece together letters, diaries, and testimonies, finding patterns of abuse buried beneath layers of denial. And each discovery peels back another layer of America's myth, exposing the filthy lies beneath the polished image of white feminine purity. Once uncovered, these secrets shook not only individual families, but the very foundation of the cultural myth itself. Because if the so-called guardians of morality were not innocent, if they were in fact obsessed, cruel, and complicit, then the entire story America told itself about slavery crumbles. The world long denied women's capacity for cruelty, painting them as helpless victims of men's dominance. But the evidence whispers otherwise. Mistresses were not passive, they were participants. Sometimes they were architects of torment,